Hello there, and welcome back. If this is your first time here, we make long, slow histories designed to help you drift off, so there is no need to follow every word. Just let the voice carry you. In the autumn of 1845, something began happening in the fields of Ireland that no farmer had ever seen before. It started small. A dark spot on a leaf here. A soft, discolored patch on a stem there. Within days, entire fields that had looked healthy and green in the morning were black and collapsing by nightfall. The smell came next. A heavy, rotting sweetness that clung to clothing and hair and refused to leave. It drifted over hedgerows, into cottages, down country roads, until whole counties smelled of decay. Families who had built their entire lives around a single crop, who had eaten almost nothing but potatoes for generations, walked out to their gardens one morning and found that their food, their savings, their winter, and in many cases their children's survival, had simply dissolved into the ground overnight. Over the 7 years that followed, roughly 1 million people in Ireland starved to death. Another million packed what little they owned onto overcrowded, disease-ridden ships and left the only home they had ever known, many of them dying before they ever saw land again. It remains one of the great human catastrophes of the 19th century, and it was caused, almost unbelievably, by the failure of a single root vegetable, a lumpy, unglamorous, dirt-covered tuber that most of Europe had refused to even put in their mouths less than 200 years earlier. That was 1845. But the story of the potato does not begin there. It does not begin in Ireland at all. To understand how a humble root vegetable became powerful enough to reshape the population of an entire nation, we need to travel back much further than any famine, much further than any king or conqueror, back past the entire history of Europe touching the Americas at all. We need to go back roughly 8,000 years, high into the mountains of South America, to a place where the air is thin, the nights are brutally cold, and the soil looks almost too poor to grow anything at all. Picture the Andes Mountains as they were long before any of the empires we now associate with them existed. Around the shores of Lake Titicaca, on the high plateau straddling what is today southern Peru and Bolivia, the land sits more than 12,000 feet above sea level. At that altitude, the air is so thin that a newcomer's lungs ache within minutes of exertion. The sun during the day is intense and unfiltered, strong enough to burn exposed skin in under an hour. Yet the moment that sun dips below the mountain ridges, the temperature can plunge below freezing within a single hour. This is a landscape of extremes, one that seems almost designed to make farming impossible. And yet, scattered across those rocky, wind-swept slopes, wild potato plants somehow managed to grow, not the golden, smooth-skinned potatoes you might picture today. These were small, often no larger than a walnut, twisted and knobby, growing low to the ground in a landscape that offered them very little protection. The people who first began paying close attention to these wild tubers, ancestors of the Aymara and Quechua peoples, were not farmers in any modern sense yet. They were still moving through a long, slow transition, gathering wild plants, hunting what they could, watching the mountains for any sign of a reliable food source in a place where reliability was almost non-existent. And here is the part of this story that tends to surprise people the most. Those wild potatoes were not simply plain or bland. They were genuinely dangerous. Wild potato tubers naturally produce a family of chemical compounds called glycoalkaloids, most notably solanine and tomatine. These are the plant's own defense system, chemical weapons developed over countless generations to discourage animals from eating it. In sufficient quantities, these compounds cause nausea, vomiting, painful stomach cramps, and in severe cases, they can kill. Anyone who has ever heard that you should avoid eating a potato that has turned green is hearing a very distant echo of this ancient danger. That green tinge is a sign of rising solanine levels, a warning your modern potato is still quietly giving you, even though thousands of years of careful selection have made it mild enough for us to largely forget the danger was ever there at all. So imagine being one of those early Andean foragers. You are hungry. The mountain offers few options. And here is a plant producing something starchy and filling beneath the soil. And yet, eating it carelessly can make you violently ill, or worse. Most people, faced with that kind of risk, might reasonably decide to leave it alone entirely and search for something safer. But the people living around Lake Titicaca did something remarkable instead, over an unknown number of generations. Through trial, error, and almost certainly through real losses along the way, they slowly worked out how to make the poison leave the plant. The method they developed was slow, deliberate, and required a deep, intuitive understanding of chemistry that none of them would ever have described using that word. First, they would submerge the wild tubers in the cold, fast-moving water of mountain streams for several days at a time. The constant flow of icy water gradually pulled the bitter, toxic compounds out of the flesh of the potato, the same way rinsing away a stain slowly lifts it out of fabric. Then, once the tubers had soaked long enough, they would be spread out across the ground at high altitude and left through the freezing Andean nights. As the temperature dropped well below zero after dark, the moisture inside the tubers would freeze solid. When the fierce equatorial sun rose again in the morning, that same moisture would begin to thaw, and the potatoes would soften just enough to be pressed and worked by hand or foot. This cycle of freezing, thawing, and pressing would be repeated again and again over the course of several days, gradually breaking down the remaining toxic compounds along with much of the water content itself, until what remained was safer, lighter, and far less bitter than what had come out of the ground. It was slow. It was physically demanding. It offered no guarantee of success on any single attempt. And it worked, well enough that entire communities came to depend on it. But detoxifying individual harvests was only the beginning of a much longer process, one that would quietly unfold over thousands of years without ever being written down, discussed in any formal sense, or credited to any single inventor. Generation after generation, farmers would notice which plants produced tubers that were slightly less bitter, slightly less dangerous, slightly more forgiving to prepare. They would save those tubers to replant the following season instead of the harsher, more toxic ones. Then they would do it again, and again, across centuries, and eventually across thousands of years. This quiet, patient selection began to reshape the plant itself at a genetic level, long before anyone on Earth had a word for genetics. This is domestication in its truest and most human form. Not a single dramatic breakthrough, but an accumulation of thousands of small, careful decisions made by people who will never be named in any history book, who never intended to build anything as large as what eventually grew from their efforts. Archaeologists and geneticists who study the earliest potato remains generally place the beginning of this domestication somewhere between 8,000 and 5,000 years before the present, though the exact starting point remains genuinely debated. And some researchers argue the earliest human contact with wild potatoes in South America may stretch back even further than that. What is far less debated is the outcome. somewhere in that long, unrecorded stretch of time. The wild, toxic, walnut-sized tuber scattered across the high Andes began, tuber by tuber, season by season, to become something different, something starchier, something milder, something that a hungry person could eventually eat without fear. None of the people doing this work could have imagined what it would eventually become. They were not trying to build an empire. They were trying to survive one brutal Andean winter at a time, in a landscape that offered very little room for error. And yet, without knowing it, they were laying the foundation for one of the most important food crops in the entire history of the human species, one that would eventually feed armies, build empires, cross oceans, spark wars, cause devastating famines, and centuries later be seriously considered as one of the first crops humanity might ever grow on another planet entirely. But that transformation from a wild, defensive, mildly poisonous mountain plant into a true agricultural cornerstone did not stop with simple detoxification and quiet selective breeding. As the centuries wore on, the peoples of the high Andes did not just learn to tolerate the potato. They began to organize entire societies around it, developing agricultural techniques so advanced that they would eventually allow one civilization to turn this humble root into the backbone of an empire stretching across an entire continent. And that is exactly where our story turns next. The centuries rolled on, and the descendants of those patient mountain farmers did not stay still. Long before the empire most people picture when they think of ancient Peru ever existed, other civilizations had already risen and fallen across the Andean highlands, each one leaving behind pieces of knowledge that the next would inherit. Two of the most significant were the Wari and the Tiwanaku, sprawling highland societies that dominated the region for centuries, building their own irrigation systems, their own terraced fields, their own understanding of how to coax food out of unforgiving mountain terrain. And then, sometime between the years 1000 and 1200, both of these once powerful societies collapsed. Historians still debate the exact causes: prolonged drought, shifting trade networks, internal conflict, or some combination of all three. But the effect was the same. A long period of instability and fragmentation settled over the highlands. Small competing groups scattered across the mountains. And for a while, no single power controlled the region at all. It was into this uncertain world, sometime around the year 1400, that a small group centered in the valley of Cusco began to expand. What followed was one of the most astonishing rises to power in the history of the ancient world. In less than a single century, this group grew from a modest regional presence into the largest empire the Americas had ever seen. Stretching along the spine of the continent from what is now southern Colombia all the way down into modern Chile and Argentina. We know them today as the Inca, and while history often remembers them for their gold, their stonework, and their roads, the truth is that none of it would have been possible without a much humbler foundation sitting quietly underground. To understand how the Inca fed an empire of this scale, you have to picture the land they were working with. This was not gentle, rolling farmland. This was some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. Steep mountainsides, thin oxygen, soil that shifted from fertile to barren within the space of a short walk, and temperatures that could swing from scorching to freezing within a single day. And yet, walking through the highlands around Cusco, you would have seen the mountains themselves reshaped by human hands, carved into wide, level terraces that climbed the slopes like enormous stone staircases, each one designed to hold soil in place, capture rainfall, and create its own slightly different microclimate. Some terraces sat low and warm, others high and cold, and Inca farmers understood, with remarkable precision, exactly which crops belonged on which level. In the flatter, waterlogged basins near lakes and rivers, Andean farmers had also developed something even more ingenious, a technique now known as waru, or raised field agriculture. Workers would dig long, parallel canals into wet, marshy ground, piling the removed soil into raised planting beds between them. During the freezing highland nights, the water sitting in those canals would absorb the day's heat and slowly release it back into the air, protecting the crops on the raised beds above from a killing frost. It was, in effect, a low-tech thermal regulation system, built entirely from mud, water, and centuries of careful observation, and it allowed farming to continue in places where a single unprotected frost could otherwise destroy an entire harvest overnight. Across this patchwork of terraces and raised fields, Inca farmers were not growing one single type of potato. They were cultivating an almost unbelievable variety, well over 3,000 distinct kinds, each adapted to its own particular altitude, soil, and microclimate. There were potatoes with skins of deep purple and flesh the color of a sunset. There were bright yellow varieties, blood red ones, and some so dark they appeared almost black in low light. Some were small and perfectly round, others long and twisted, and some looked so gnarled and irregular that a modern grocery shopper might not recognize them as potatoes at all. This was not simply variety for its own sake. Each type had been selected over generations for a specific purpose. Some suited to the icy plateau above 12,000 feet, others to warmer, gentler valley floors, others prized specifically for how well they endured the harsh preservation process that would turn them into long-term stores of food. And that process was arguably the single greatest innovation the Inca inherited and refined, because in a world without refrigeration, without airtight containers, without any of the preservation tools we take for granted today, storage was the single hardest problem in agriculture. A fresh potato left sitting in a warehouse will soften, sprout, and rot within a matter of months. For an empire that needed to feed soldiers on months-long military campaigns, laborers, building roads and temples, and entire cities during years when the harvest failed, that kind of fragility was simply not acceptable. The solution the Andean peoples had already been developing for thousands of years, and which the Inca now deployed on an imperial scale, was a remarkable piece of food technology called chuño. The process itself was simple in concept, but demanding in execution. Freshly harvested potatoes would be spread out across open ground at high altitude, where nighttime temperatures regularly plunge well below freezing. Left overnight, the tubers would freeze completely solid. Then, as the intense equatorial sun rose the next morning and began warming the mountainside, the potatoes would slowly thaw, and at that exact point, workers, often entire families working together, would walk barefoot across the thawing tubers, pressing and squeezing them underfoot to force out the melting moisture. This cycle, freeze overnight, thaw and press by day, would be repeated for several days in succession, gradually pulling nearly all the water out of the potato. What eventually remained was a light, pale, almost weightless block of dried starch, a fraction of its original size and weight, yet still packed with the nutrition of the original crop. The result was extraordinary. Properly made chuño could be stored for years without spoiling, and, by some accounts, under the right conditions. Certain batches could last for well over a decade, though exactly how long remains a point of some disagreement among those who study Andean food history. What is beyond dispute is that this transformed the potato from a fragile, perishable crop into something closer to a strategic reserve, a form of food that could sit quietly in storage for years, waiting for the moment it was needed. And the Inca built an enormous logistical network specifically to take advantage of it. Scattered throughout the empire were state storehouses known as quolca, carefully constructed buildings with stone foundations and thatched roofs, engineered to keep air circulating and moisture out. These storehouses held vast reserves of chuño alongside other preserved goods, positioned along the empire's extensive road network so that soldiers, laborers, and officials moving across the realm would always have access to food, no matter how far they traveled from their home villages. This was not a minor convenience. It was one of the true engines of Inca power. An army that carries only fresh food can only travel as far as its supplies allow before it must stop, forage, or starve. An army supported by a network of storehouses filled with a food that does not spoil can march for months, deep into unfamiliar territory, and never lose its ability to eat. Chuño fed soldiers on distant campaigns, fed laborers constructing the empire's famous roads and terraces, and fed entire populations during years when fresh harvests failed. It was, in the most literal sense, one of the first processed foods in human history, and it may have quietly done as much to build and hold together the Inca Empire as any weapon or army ever did. But chuño was far from the only thing Andean ingenuity managed to coax out of the potato. There was also tocosh, a fermented potato product made by submerging tubers in cold, slow-moving stream water for weeks at a time, allowing natural fermentation to transform both the texture and the nutritional profile of the crop, producing something that could later be cooked into thick, hearty stews. There was almidón de papa, a fine potato starch extracted by grinding, soaking, and carefully filtering the tubers, used both as a food thickener and in various practical applications throughout Andean life. Between fresh potatoes, chuño, tocosh, and potato starch, Andean peoples had, remarkably, built an entire food processing industry around a single crop, centuries before anything resembling industrial food production existed anywhere else on Earth. And the potato's importance in Andean society reached far beyond nutrition alone. This was not simply a crop that people happened to eat. It was woven into the deeper rhythms of daily and spiritual life. In some communities, potatoes were placed alongside the dead when they were buried, offerings meant to accompany a person into whatever came next. Farmers watched the way certain potato plants grew, flowered, or reacted to changing conditions as a way of predicting the coming season's weather, reading subtle signs in the crop the same way sailors might read the sky. Time itself was sometimes measured in relation to the potato, with some accounts describing how the length of time it took to cook a simple pot of potatoes served as an informal unit for measuring the passage of an hour. Distance, too, could be measured in potato terms, with travelers calculating how much dried chuño they would need to carry to sustain themselves across a given journey, turning the crop into something close to a unit of measurement for both time and space. By the height of Inca power, the potato was no longer simply a food source. It had become deeply embedded in how an entire civilization understood the world around it, how it fed its people, supplied its armies, endured its famines, and even how it marked the passing of days and distances. This was not a primitive relationship between people and plant. This was one of the most sophisticated agricultural systems that existed anywhere on Earth at the time, built entirely without writing, without iron tools, and without a single word for the science underlying any of it. And yet, none of this sophistication, none of this careful science, none of these thousands of years of patient breeding and preservation would matter in the slightest to the people who were about to arrive on Andean shores. A wave of outsiders was coming, and they would look at everything the Inca had built around this humble root vegetable and see almost nothing of value in it at all. What they wanted glittered far more brightly than a potato ever could. And the collision between what they wanted and what the Inca had actually built was about to set the potato on an entirely different and far stranger path across the world. The outsiders arrived in the year 1532, under the command of a Spanish soldier named Francisco Pizarro. And what they found when they finally reached the heart of the Inca Empire was staggering almost beyond belief. Cities built from precisely fitted stone, temples covered in sheets of gold so thick that entire walls seemed to glow in the sunlight, storehouses filled with silver ornaments, ceremonial vessels, and treasures the likes of which most of the Spaniards had never seen in their lives. Within a matter of years, through a brutal combination of warfare, disease, and the exploitation of a civil conflict already tearing the Inca Empire apart from within, Pizarro and his men had toppled one of the largest and most sophisticated empires the Americas had ever produced. And having done so, the Spanish set about extracting everything of value they could find: gold, silver, precious stones, anything that glittered, anything that could be melted down, shipped across an ocean, and turned into wealth for a distant crown. What they walked past, almost without a second glance, was the very thing that had actually kept this empire fed, organized, and functioning for generations. The potato meant nothing to them. It was dirty. It grew underground, out of sight, out of mind. It carried none of the shine, none of the immediate, obvious value that a bar of silver carried. To conquistadors focused entirely on treasure, a lumpy, unglamorous root vegetable simply did not register as anything worth their attention. And yet, in one of the great quiet ironies of this entire story, the Spanish were, without fully realizing it, depending on that very crop to fuel the wealth they were so desperate to extract. High in the mountains of what is now Bolivia sat a single mountain that would come to define an entire era of Spanish colonial wealth. A mountain containing what was, at the time, the largest silver deposit ever discovered anywhere on Earth. The Spanish called it Cerro Rico, the rich hill, and around its base grew the mining town of Potosí, a settlement that would eventually swell into one of the largest cities in the entire world, larger at its peak than London, larger than Madrid itself, built entirely around the brutal extraction of silver from deep inside that single mountain. Running a mining operation of that scale, in a location that high and that remote, required feeding an enormous population of laborers, many of them indigenous workers conscripted into grueling, often fatal conditions underground, and the food that fed them, the food that quietly sustained the entire operation responsible for pouring staggering quantities of silver into the Spanish treasury, was chuño, the very same freeze-dried, sun-cured potato product the Inca had spent centuries perfecting, was now being produced in enormous quantities specifically to feed the mining workforce at Potosí. The Spanish crown was, in effect, running its most valuable colonial enterprise on a food source it considered beneath its notice. Extracted from a plant it had barely bothered to look at twice. The gold and silver moving across the Atlantic in the holds of Spanish galleons existed, in no small part, because a humble, freeze-dried potato was quietly keeping thousands of exhausted laborers alive at 14,000 feet above sea level. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it tells you almost everything you need to know about how differently the Spanish and the Inca understood value. One civilization had spent thousands of years building an entire agricultural and logistical system around a plant capable of feeding armies and surviving years of famine. The other civilization walked directly past that achievement in pursuit of something that glittered, without ever recognizing that the very food keeping its own colonial machine running had already solved a problem far more fundamental than where the next shipment of silver was coming from. Given how little regard the Spanish held for the potato, it should come as no surprise that its journey across the Atlantic happened quietly, almost accidentally, with none of the fanfare that accompanied the treasure ships arriving back in Spain. Sometime around the year 1570, Spanish sailors and colonial administrators began bringing potatoes back to the Iberian Peninsula, likely as little more than practical, unremarkable cargo. There were no celebrations, no formal announcements to the Spanish court, no triumphant unveiling before nobles and clergy the way other exotic discoveries from the Americas had sometimes been presented. The potato simply arrived, largely unnoticed, treated as a minor curiosity rather than anything worth serious attention. And the uses the Spanish initially found for it reflected exactly how little status it carried. Ships sailing long ocean voyages began stocking potatoes as basic provisions, valued mainly for their usefulness in helping prevent scurvy among crews trapped at sea for months at a time without fresh food. Beyond the ports, potatoes were quietly distributed to hospitals and monasteries, where they became food for the sick, the poor, and the otherwise forgotten members of Spanish society. This was not a food fit for a nobleman's table. It was a food you gave to people you did not expect to complain, people with no real choice in what they were fed. The Spanish crown, consumed with counting the staggering flow of gold and silver arriving from its new colonies, had no interest whatsoever in promoting a food that had come from people it viewed as conquered subjects rather than teachers with anything valuable to offer. Whatever wisdom the Inca had built up over thousands of years about this plant, whatever significance it once held in matters of storage, survival, and even spiritual life, arrived in Spain completely stripped of context, reduced to nothing more than a strange, dirt-covered vegetable fit only for sailors, invalids, and the poor. It seemed, at the time, like an unremarkable footnote in the much larger story of Spanish conquest and colonial wealth, a minor crop, quietly overlooked, carrying none of the urgency or excitement of gold and silver. But this quiet, almost accidental arrival on European soil was about to set something much larger into motion. Because once the potato crossed the mountains, separating Spain from the rest of the continent, it was going to run headlong into a Europe that did not simply ignore it the way the Spanish had. Europe was about to look at this strange new plant from the Americas and react with something far closer to outright fear. When the potato finally made its way over the mountains and rivers, separating Spain from the rest of the European continent, arriving in other parts of Europe sometime in the late 1500s and the early 1600s, it did not simply slide quietly into kitchens and onto dinner tables the way you might expect a new source of food to do. Instead, it walked directly into a wall of suspicion, discomfort, and in some places, outright horror. And to understand why an ordinary root vegetable could provoke that kind of reaction, you have to understand exactly how Europeans at the time thought about food, about status, and about the natural order of the world itself. For centuries, the backbone of European agriculture had been grain: wheat, barley, oats, rye. These crops grew upward, tall stalks reaching toward open sky, ripening in full sunlight where everyone could see them, harvested in golden fields that had come to symbolize abundance and divine blessing for as long as anyone could remember. Bread made from this grain was not simply food. It carried deep religious weight. Treated in many parts of Christian Europe as something close to a gift handed down directly from God. Entire economies were structured around grain cultivation. Entire feudal systems. Entire tax structures. Entire calendars of religious festivals revolved around the planting and harvesting of these noble crops that rose confidently out of the earth toward the heavens. The potato did the exact opposite of everything grain represented. It did not reach toward the sky. It hid beneath the soil, growing in darkness, invisible until someone dug it up. Its skin was often rough, uneven, covered in small growths that people at the time referred to as eyes, giving the whole tuber an unsettling, almost watchful appearance. And perhaps worst of all, in a Europe deeply attentive to botanical classification, naturalists quickly noticed that the potato plant belonged to the same family as one of the most feared and genuinely poisonous plants growing wild across the continent: deadly nightshade. Early botanical writers who examined the plant, including English herbalists cataloguing the strange new arrivals from the Americas, often placed the potato in their books directly alongside its more dangerous relatives, describing its flowers and leaves with the same cautious, slightly wary language they used for plants known to poison livestock. To people living in societies where religious explanation and natural observation were tightly woven together, this was not simply an interesting botanical coincidence. It felt like a warning, a signal from the natural world, or perhaps from something beyond it, that this strange new plant from across the ocean was not meant for human consumption at all. And once that fear took root, it spread with remarkable speed, often far outpacing the actual physical spread of the crop itself, moving from town to town, pulpit to pulpit, faster than any farmer could plant a single field. In parts of France, the potato became formally associated with one of the most feared diseases of the era. Local authorities in the city of Besançon went so far as to ban the cultivation of potatoes entirely in the closing years of the 1500s, acting on the belief that eating the crop could cause leprosy. It did not matter that no genuine medical evidence supported this claim. The visual association was enough. A disfiguring disease on one hand, a lumpy, disfigured-looking vegetable on the other, and in the minds of frightened officials, that resemblance was reason enough to outlaw an entire food source across their jurisdiction. For ordinary farmers living under that ban, the message was simple and absolute. This plant was not merely unappetizing. It was dangerous enough to be a matter of law. And growing it in your own garden could bring the attention of the very authorities meant to protect public health. Farther east, in Prussia, resistance took on an even more explicitly religious tone. The Russian Orthodox Church, deeply influential in shaping everyday belief and behavior, openly condemned the potato, referring to it in some accounts as the devil's apple, and warning that consuming it amounted to a sin against God himself. For deeply religious communities, this was not a minor objection. It placed the act of eating a potato within the same moral category as any other serious transgression against divine law, discouraging its spread among ordinary believers for generations, and turning what should have been a simple question of nutrition into a matter of eternal consequence. weighed against the fate of one's soul rather than the emptiness of one's stomach, across parts of Germany and Switzerland. The objections took a slightly different, though no less serious, shape. Rumors circulated that eating potatoes caused uncontrollable flatulence, that it inflamed dangerous and uncontrollable desires in those who consumed it, and that it could bring on scrofula, a painful and disfiguring form of tuberculosis that caused grotesque swelling in the neck. Beyond the purely physical concerns, there was a broader unease that eating this strange, underground crop might lead to a general decline in morality itself, as though something about its unnatural growing habits, hidden from the sun, could seep quietly into the character of anyone who regularly consumed it. A food, in other words, was not simply judged by what it did to the body. It was judged by what people feared it might do to the soul. And in villages where superstition and faith shaped nearly every decision of daily life, that fear was more than enough to keep the potato out of the cooking pot for generation after generation. And then there is Scotland, home to what might be the single strangest chapter in this entire story of religious resistance. Scottish Presbyterian communities in some regions refused to grow or eat potatoes for a reason that sounds almost too unusual to be true, and yet was entirely sincere at the time. The word potato appeared nowhere in the Bible. To certain clergymen, this silence was not a minor detail. It was proof. If God had intended this particular plant to serve as food for human beings, surely Scripture would have mentioned it somewhere across its many pages describing crops, harvests, and divine provision. Its complete absence from the text was treated as evidence that the potato existed entirely outside God's plan for human nourishment. This was not a joke told at the time, nor an exaggeration invented later for entertainment. It was a genuine theological position, argued seriously by real clergymen standing in real churches, shaping the eating habits of entire communities for years, in a debate that today sounds almost impossible to take seriously, and yet at the time carried the full weight of Scripture and salvation behind it. Entire congregations went without a food that could have eased their hunger, guided by ministers who genuinely believed they were protecting their flock from something Scripture itself had chosen to leave unmentioned. It is easy, looking back from where we sit today, to smile at these objections, the leprosy claims, the devil's apple, the missing verse in Scripture. But it helps to remember that these were not ignorant people making careless guesses. They were living in a world where disease spread in ways nobody could explain, where crop failures could wipe out a village overnight, and where any unfamiliar plant arriving from a distant, unknown land carried a very reasonable amount of risk. Europe had, after all, already been burned once by unfamiliar imports from the Americas. Tobacco had arrived trailing its own share of medical claims and counterclaims. Tomatoes, another member of that same suspicious nightshade family, were treated with almost identical wariness in many of the same regions, sometimes grown for decades purely as ornamental plants before anyone worked up the courage to actually eat one. Seen in that light, the fear surrounding the potato was not some uniquely irrational panic. It was simply how an entire continent tended to treat anything strange, unfamiliar, and pulled from a part of the world most Europeans would never see with their own eyes. Faced with this wall of suspicion stretching across so much of the continent, the potato spent the better part of 2 centuries occupying a strange, almost decorative role in European life. Wealthy households and royal gardens grew it not as food, but as an ornamental curiosity, admired for its delicate flowers rather than its edible tubers hidden beneath the soil. Those flowers, small blossoms in soft shades of purple and white, were considered genuinely attractive. Elegant enough that Marie Antoinette herself reportedly wore potato blossoms woven into her hair at French court events. Treating what we would now consider a humble vegetable flower as a fashionable, almost exotic accessory. A small irony that would have seemed unthinkable to the peasants who still refused to put the plant anywhere near their dinner tables. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment. A queen adorning herself with the flowers of a plant that clergymen elsewhere were condemning from the pulpit as unfit for human consumption. Two entirely different Europes existing side by side, separated not by distance but by class. Botanical gardens in major European cities, including London, Seville, and Vienna, proudly displayed potato plants alongside other unusual specimens brought back from the Americas, presenting them to visitors as strange scientific novelties rather than anything resembling a practical food source. Scholars wrote lengthy papers debating whether the tuber was edible, medicinal, or genuinely dangerous, treating the question with the same seriousness they might apply to any other unresolved mystery of natural science, filling university lecture halls with arguments over a vegetable that any hungry peasant could have simply tried eating and survived. Some physicians even prescribed it in small quantities as a remedy for various ailments, while warning patients against consuming too much, as though the plant were closer to a medicine to be measured carefully than an ordinary food to be enjoyed freely at the table. In some of these accounts, the potato was recommended in small, cautious doses for exhaustion or weakness, treated less like a vegetable and more like an unpredictable tonic whose full effects on the human body remained genuinely uncertain. But actually eating the thing, incorporating it into daily meals the way one might eat bread or porridge, remained, for most of European society, simply beneath consideration. Potatoes were widely regarded as suitable animal feed at best, and at worst, as an unmistakable marker of desperate poverty. In England, even among the poorest agricultural labourers, being offered potatoes instead of bread was often taken as a genuine insult, a suggestion that the person offering the meal viewed you as barely above livestock. The associations ran deep and were rarely subtle. Bread represented civilization, order, and divine blessing. Potatoes represented dirt, poverty, and a crop unworthy of a respectable table. A hierarchy so deeply embedded in daily life that it would take far more than good sense to overturn it. For nearly 200 years, it seemed as though the potato might remain permanently trapped in this strange, contradictory position, admired for its flowers, feared for its family tree, dismissed as food fit only for animals and the desperate, while millions of ordinary people across Europe continued to struggle with unreliable grain harvests and the ever-present threat of famine sitting just beyond the next bad growing season. Bad weather could ruin a wheat harvest in a single wet summer. And when that happened, entire regions faced the very real prospect of starvation, even while a hardier, more forgiving crop sat quietly ignored in the gardens of the wealthy, valued only for the color of its flowers. It would have been entirely reasonable, standing in Europe at that time, to assume the potato was destined to remain a forgotten botanical curiosity forever, a strange plant from across the ocean that flowered beautifully in a nobleman's garden and never once found its way onto anyone's plate. But that is not what happened, because war was coming, famine was coming, and a small handful of remarkably stubborn, occasionally eccentric leaders were about to look at this despised underground crop and see something that everyone else around them had somehow completely missed. The first place where this despised underground crop finally found a ruler willing to look past 2 centuries of superstition was of all places. One of the most war-torn corners of Europe, the Kingdom of Prussia. And the man who forced that change was not a farmer, not a priest, not a scholar debating botany in some quiet university hall. He was a king, and he had spent most of his reign watching his country get dragged, again and again, into brutal, expensive wars with its neighbors. Frederick II of Prussia, remembered by history as Frederick the Great, ruled from 1740 to 1786, and war followed him almost from the moment he took the throne. The War of the Austrian Succession consumed much of the 1740s, and by the time that conflict finally wound down, an even larger and more devastating war was already gathering on the horizon. The 7 Years' War, which would tear across Europe from 1756 to 1763. Prussia sat in a dangerous position, surrounded by larger and often hostile powers, and Frederick understood something that many of his contemporaries preferred not to think about too closely. Every time an army marched across Prussian territory, whether it was his own soldiers or an invading force, the land itself became a weapon. For centuries, the standard tactic for weakening an enemy population had been simple and devastatingly effective. Ride through their fields with torches. Burn the wheat. Burn the barley. Burn the standing grain before it could ever be harvested. Grain sat exposed above the ground, tall and visible, impossible to hide and painfully easy to destroy. A single night of deliberate burning could erase an entire season of a family's food supply, and by extension, could starve the soldiers and civilians who depended on that harvest to survive the winter. Frederick had watched this happen to his own kingdom more than once, watched enemy forces march through Prussian farmland and leave nothing behind but smoke and ash where wheat fields had stood only days before. It was a devastating strategy precisely because it exploited the one great weakness of grain agriculture: its total visibility. A field of ripening wheat announces itself for miles. Gold against green. Impossible to conceal, and just as impossible to protect once an enemy column decided it was worth the trouble to set alight. But there was a crop that fire could not reach nearly so easily. A crop that did not stand exposed in tall, golden rows waiting to be torched. It grew hidden beneath the soil, invisible to a passing army, indifferent to whether soldiers marched directly across the field above it. An invading force could trample straight over a potato field without ever realizing that an entire winter's worth of food was sitting quietly just inches beneath their boots. Frederick, ever the pragmatist, ever the ruler willing to set aside inherited superstition when it stood in the way of keeping his kingdom fed and his armies supplied, saw the military logic immediately. And once he saw it, he refused to let it go. Over the course of his reign, Frederick issued at least 15 separate decrees promoting potato cultivation across Prussian territory, a series of directives that history now remembers collectively as the Kartoffelbefehl, or the Potato Order. The most famous and consequential of these went out on the 24th of March in the year 1756, addressed to the officials and district administrators of Silesia, one of Prussia's most important agricultural regions. In the aftermath of a punishing famine that had already swept through Pomerania and left the kingdom's grain supplies dangerously thin, this was not a gentle suggestion. Frederick commanded his peasants to plant potatoes, and made clear that those who refused to comply could face serious punishment, with some accounts describing threats as severe as having a farmer's ears and nose cut off for outright defiance. The peasants, as you might expect after 2 centuries of inherited fear surrounding this exact plant, were not enthusiastic. According to one story, that has been repeated and embellished many times over the centuries since. Villagers in the town of Kolberg sent word back to the king with a blunt, almost defiant assessment of his beloved new crop, insisting that the potato had neither smell nor taste, and that not even a starving dog would bother to eat it. It is easy to imagine the exasperation on both sides of that exchange. A king convinced he was offering his people salvation from famine, and villagers convinced their king was trying to force them to eat something closer to livestock feed than actual food. Resistance like this was not confined to Kolberg alone. Across Silesia and the surrounding provinces, officials tasked with enforcing the king's decrees reported back with a familiar litany of excuses. Soil too poor, seasons too short, or simply a flat refusal dressed up in whatever polite language a frightened peasant could manage when addressing a royal official. Frederick had underestimated just how deeply 2 centuries of inherited suspicion could root itself into a community's daily habits, and mere royal paperwork, however sternly worded, was proving no match for it. Frederick, however, was not simply a man who issued commands and hoped for the best. According to a story that has circulated in various forms ever since, when threats alone failed to change minds quickly enough, Frederick tried something considerably more clever. He planted a royal potato garden on the outskirts of Berlin and stationed uniformed soldiers around its perimeter, standing guard as though protecting something of enormous value. He said almost nothing about why the guards were there. He did not need to. Word spread on its own, whispered from one village to the next, that whatever was growing inside that heavily guarded garden must be worth stealing. Prussian peasants, the story goes, began sneaking past the soldiers under cover of darkness to steal seed potatoes for their own gardens. Precisely the outcome Frederick had supposedly hoped for all along. Since a stolen potato planted at home did just as much good for the kingdom's food supply as one planted under official instruction. It is worth pausing here to be honest about how much of this particular story we can actually trust. Many historians studying Frederick's reign today are considerably more cautious about the guarded garden legend than the popular version of the tale suggests, noting that the immediate, real-world impact of the potato decrees appears to have been more limited and more gradual than the dramatic story implies, and that this specific tale of reverse psychology may well have been polished and exaggerated across generations of retelling long after Frederick himself was gone. Whether every detail happened exactly as the legend describes or not, what remains beyond serious dispute is the broader trajectory that followed. Slowly, decree by decree, harvest by harvest, resistance among Prussian farmers began to soften, and there was a second force working alongside the king's stubborn persistence, one far less romantic than any garden full of guarded tubers, but considerably more persuasive over time. Hunger has a way of eroding even the most deeply held superstitions. No sermon, no royal decree, no threat of a cut-off ear or nose has ever proven quite as convincing as the simple, physical sensation of an empty stomach growling through another cold Prussian winter. As wars continued to strain Prussian grain supplies, as bad harvests threatened famine again and again, families who had once sworn the potato was fit only for animals found themselves increasingly willing to plant it in the corner of a garden, just in case the wheat failed again. Once that first hesitant harvest came in, once families discovered that this strange, ugly, underground vegetable could actually fill a hungry stomach without any of the disasters the old rumors had promised, the resistance that had held for 2 centuries began to crumble far faster than anyone might have expected. By the time the 7 Years' War finally ground to its exhausted conclusion in 1763, the potato had transformed from a crop that villagers openly mocked as unfit for dogs into a genuine staple of the Prussian diet. Within roughly a single generation, fields across Prussia and much of northern Germany that had once grown only grain now included wide rows of potato plants as well. A hedge against exactly the kind of famine and wartime devastation that had haunted the region for as long as anyone could remember. What had begun as a king's stubborn, sometimes heavy-handed insistence had, by the 1770s and 1780s, become something closer to common sense, a lesson written not in scripture or superstition, but in the simple, undeniable arithmetic of an empty stomach. Prussian cookbooks that had once ignored the potato entirely began including it as a matter of course, and what had started as a suspicious, unfamiliar tuber grown reluctantly in a corner of the garden was, within a few decades, showing up on the tables of soldiers, farmers, and eventually the aristocracy itself, the very same class that had once dismissed it as fit only for livestock. Frederick had done what 2 centuries of botanical curiosity, royal flower arrangements, and quiet scholarly debate had failed to accomplish. He had made the potato ordinary. He had made it Prussian. And word of what he had done, and more importantly, why he had done it, was about to cross the border into a neighboring kingdom, where a very different kind of man, not a monarch at all, but a former prisoner of war with a taste for spectacle, was about to take Frederick's stubborn, practical lesson and turn it into something closer to theatre. The man Prussia's example was about to influence was named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier, and his introduction to the potato came about in about the least glamorous way imaginable. Parmentier had trained as a pharmacist and was serving with the French army during the 7 Years' War, the very same conflict that had forced Frederick the Great to gamble so heavily on his underground crop. When Parmentier had the misfortune of being captured by Prussian forces, he would spend the following years as a prisoner of war, and during that captivity, the food his Prussian captors handed him, meal after meal, day after day, was potatoes. It was not a delicacy. It was not a gesture of kindness. It was simply what the Prussians had in abundance, thanks to the very decrees we just described, and it was what they fed to prisoners. They had no particular interest in pampering. Parmentier ate potatoes for years, with essentially no other options available to him. And here is the twist that would end up mattering to an entire nation. He did not die. He did not develop leprosy. He did not lose his mind or his morals. Despite 2 centuries of French superstition insisting that any of those outcomes were entirely possible for anyone who made this vegetable a regular part of their diet. In fact, by the time his captivity finally ended, Parmentier emerged in surprisingly good health, arguably better health than many French soldiers who had spent the same years eating the standard military rations back home. For a man trained in the sciences, this was not a small detail to simply shrug off. It was a direct, personnel, undeniable contradiction of everything his own country believed about this crop, and he could not stop thinking about what it meant. He began quietly running his own informal observations, comparing what he had eaten to what the science of his day claimed should have happened to him, and the gap between the two was impossible to ignore. Either the accepted wisdom about this vegetable was wrong, or he had somehow been the exception to a rule that had held for 200 years. Parmentier, being a man of science rather than superstition, was inclined to believe the former. Once he returned to France, Parmentier dedicated the next several decades of his life to a single, almost obsessive mission. He intended to convince the French people to eat potatoes, and he intended to do it even if it meant using every trick, every ounce of charm, and every social connection available to a former military pharmacist with a point to prove. What followed was less a scientific campaign and more something closer to an 18th century public relations operation. Decades before anyone had a name for that kind of work, Parmentier began by targeting the one group whose approval could change public opinion overnight: the aristocracy of Paris. He hosted elaborate dinner parties for the city's most fashionable and influential guests, where every single course, appetizer, soup, main dish, even dessert, was crafted entirely from potatoes. Guests who arrived expecting a curiosity left, having eaten an entire meal built around the very vegetable their grandparents had once been warned might cause leprosy or moral decay. Parmentier understood something simple but powerful. If the wealthiest and most fashionable people in Paris could be seen enjoying potatoes at an elegant table, the crop's reputation among everyone below them on the social ladder would begin shifting almost automatically. He did not stop at dinner parties. Parmentier presented potato blossoms directly to King Louis XVI. And, according to accounts of the time, the king was charmed enough to tuck one of the delicate purple flowers into his own buttonhole and wear it around the palace. A small, almost throwaway gesture that nonetheless carried enormous symbolic weight in a court obsessed with appearances. Parmentier went further still, working to convince Queen Marie Antoinette to wear potato blossoms in her hair during court appearances, turning what had once been dismissed as a lowly root vegetables flower into a genuine fashion statement among the very people who set fashion for the entire kingdom. It is a strange thing to picture, a queen who represented everything about French nobility, walking through a glittering court with flowers from a vegetable most peasants still associated with poverty and disease woven carefully into her hair. And then Parmentier borrowed a page directly from Frederick's playbook, though he added his own theatrical flourish to it. He planted a large field of potatoes in the sandy, largely infertile soil of the Sablons Plain just outside Paris, a stretch of land that had never been considered good for much of anything. During daylight hours, Parmentier stationed armed guards around the perimeter of this field, creating the same unmistakable impression Frederick had cultivated in Prussia, that whatever grew inside such a heavily protected plot must be extraordinarily valuable. But Parmentier added a clever twist of his own. Every night, once the sun went down, he deliberately withdrew the guards, leaving the field completely unprotected until morning. Curious, opportunistic Parisians, exactly as Parmentier had hoped, crept in under cover of darkness and stole potato plants for their own gardens, spreading the crop through the countryside far faster and far more organically than any royal decree could ever have managed on its own. Parmentier reportedly repeated variations of this same trick more than once, refining the theatre of it each time, learning exactly how much protection to show during the day and how completely to remove it at night in order to make the crop feel simultaneously precious and within reach. A combination almost guaranteed to provoke curiosity in anyone who caught wind of it. Parmentier was, in effect, running a one-man public relations campaign for an entire vegetable, decades before the concept of public relations existed anywhere in the world, and by the closing years of the 1700s, it had worked. France, a country whose own Parliament of Besançon had formally banned potato cultivation 2 centuries earlier over fears of leprosy, had finally, slowly, begun to accept the potato as legitimate human food. Not merely animal feed or a curiosity for the aristocracy's flower gardens, France still remembers Parmentier today in ways that go well beyond a paragraph in a history book. Sen, the classic French dish, hachis Parmentier, a comforting, layered casserole of minced meat and mashed potato that bears more than a passing resemblance to a British shepherd's pie, carries his name directly into kitchens across the country to this day. There is a Paris metro station named in his honor, along with a boulevard and a hospital. A remarkable legacy for a man who spent his life's work convincing his fellow countrymen to eat a vegetable that most of them had grown up being warned against. A man who survived captivity by eating potatoes gave his own name back to history, tied forever to the very crop that had once nearly broken him. But France was far from the only place watching Prussia's lesson unfold and slowly absorbing it in its own way. To the east, in the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a naturalist named Christoph Kluck began actively encouraging farmers to expand potato cultivation beyond small kitchen gardens and into full agricultural fields, publishing agricultural guidance in the late 1770s that treated the potato as a serious, practical crop rather than a curiosity. Polish farmers, much like their Prussian neighbors, gradually came to see the potato as a reliable hedge against the unpredictable failures of grain harvests. And it did not take long before the crop found an additional, thoroughly practical use. Distillers across Poland began fermenting potatoes into vodka, since the starchy tuber offered a cheaper, more abundant raw material than the grain that had traditionally been used. A development that would eventually help define an entire category of spirits associated with the region for centuries to come. What had begun in Prussia as a strictly military solution to the vulnerability of grain during wartime had, by the time it reached Poland, quietly transformed into an economic opportunity. Proof that a crop introduced for one reason could take root for entirely different ones once it found fertile ground, literal and otherwise. Farther east still, in Russia, the story of acceptance took a far rockier and more violent turn. Catherine the Great had attempted to promote potato cultivation as early as the 1760s, ordering seed potatoes distributed to provincial governors across her vast empire in the hope of encouraging exactly the kind of gradual adoption Prussia had managed. But Russian peasants were not nearly as compliant as Frederick's subjects had eventually proven to be. Deep suspicion, reinforced for generations by the Orthodox Church's condemnation of the crop as the devil's apple, meant that early efforts largely stalled. Decades later, in the 1840s, renewed government campaigns to force potato cultivation onto reluctant villages triggered something far more dramatic than simple foot-dragging. Entire communities rose up in open defiance. In events historians now refer to as the potato riots, with villagers burning the very potato fields officials were trying to force upon them and violently confronting the bureaucrats sent to enforce the policy. For many of these communities, the underlying objection was not simply agricultural inconvenience. It was a sense that the state was once again reaching into the most basic decisions of daily life, telling families what to plant, by extension, what to eat, in a country where resentment toward distant, heavy-handed authority already ran deep. Despite this fierce resistance, the Russian government eventually won out, through a familiar combination of continued pressure, gradual agricultural reform, and, just as had been the case in Prussia decades earlier, plain hunger. By the 1850s and into the 1860s, Russian peasants who had once burned potato fields in open revolt were growing the crop as a genuine dietary staple alongside their traditional bread. Within a few more decades, Russia had become one of the largest potato-producing nations on the entire planet. And in a small, telling detail, rural Russian communities gave the crop a nickname that captured exactly how central it had become to daily survival. They began calling it the second bread, a plant that had once been condemned from the pulpit as a sin against God. now standing quietly alongside the very food it had once been accused of insulting. It is worth noting just how strange that reversal really was. A church that had spent generations warning its faithful away from this exact crop now found itself presiding over villages where the potato had become as ordinary and unremarkable as the bread it once claimed to be a sinful mockery of. Piece by piece, kingdom by kingdom, the wall of fear that had kept the potato out of European kitchens for nearly 2 centuries was crumbling, not through any single dramatic breakthrough, but through kings with military logic, pharmacists with wounded pride and a point to prove, naturalists with practical agricultural advice, and desperate peasants who eventually chose an empty superstition over an empty stomach. And yet, none of these hard-won victories, not Frederick's decrees, not Parmentier's elaborate dinner parties, not Russia's second bread, could have prepared anyone for what was about to happen on a small, damp island just off the coast of England, where the potato was not merely going to become accepted, it was about to become almost everything. That small, damp island was Ireland. And to understand why the potato would come to mean something entirely different there than it meant in Prussia, or France, or Prussia, you first have to understand the political reality Irish families were living inside of, long before the first potato ever arrived on their shores. By the 1700s, Ireland existed under British rule, and the vast majority of Irish land was owned not by the people farming it, but by English and Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords, many of whom lived comfortably in England and had never once set foot on the estates that generated their income. The people actually working that land, Irish Catholic tenant farmers, made up the overwhelming majority of the population, and they held no ownership over the ground beneath their own feet. They rented small plots from absentee landlords, plots they could be evicted from at almost any time, for almost any reason, with little recourse and even less protection under the law. That lack of protection was not an accident or an oversight. It was policy. A series of restrictions known as the penal laws had been deliberately constructed over previous decades to limit what Irish Catholics could inherit, what property they could purchase, which professions they were permitted to enter, and critically, how much land they were allowed to lease or hold at any one time. The cumulative effect of these laws was to systematically push Irish Catholic families onto smaller and smaller parcels of land, generation after generation, as inheritances were split. Leases were restricted, and opportunities to acquire more property were closed off one after another. Families that might once have farmed a modest, sustainable acreage found themselves, within a generation or two, working plots of just 1 or 2 acres, often on the rockiest, boggiest, least forgiving soil available. Since the better land had long since been claimed by landlords or larger tenant farms, rent itself became another quiet mechanism of pressure. Landlords, or more often the agents managing estates on their behalf, could raise rents with little warning, and a tenant unable to pay faced eviction with almost no legal ground to stand on. This meant families had every incentive to subdivide their already small holdings among sons hoping to marry and start households of their own, since a small plot of one's own, however marginal, was still preferable to no plot at all. Each generation, the average holding grew a little smaller than the one before it. It is worth pausing here to really picture what 1 or 2 acres actually means for a family trying to feed itself. This is not a large garden. It is barely larger than a modest suburban lot by modern standards. And yet an entire household, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, needed to draw its entire yearly food supply from that single small patch of ground. Under those conditions, growing wheat or barley, crops that require significant acreage to produce a meaningful yield, was simply not a viable path to survival. The math did not work. A family farming 1 acre of wheat would starve long before harvest time arrived again the following year. Wheat and barley also demanded infrastructure that a family confined to a single acre simply could not access. A mill to grind grain into flour, an oven or communal bakehouse to turn that flour into bread, and enough surplus land left over to grow feed for whatever draft animal might be needed to work the soil in the first place. None of that was realistically available to a tenant farmer clinging to the edge of a bog. And this is precisely the situation the potato seemed almost eerily well suited to solve. It was not designed for Ireland. Of course, no crop is designed for anything. But the particular qualities that had made it valuable to Andean farmers 8,000 years earlier turned out to translate almost perfectly to the brutal economic reality Irish tenant farmers now found themselves trapped inside. A single acre of potatoes, properly tended, could produce enough food to feed a family of 6 for an entire year. No grain crop grown in Ireland came anywhere close to matching that kind of caloric output per acre. The potato also required remarkably little in the way of equipment or investment to plant and harvest. There was no need for a plough, no need for a horse or ox to pull one, no need for a mill to grind the harvest into something edible. All a family truly needed was a simple spade, a supply of seed potatoes saved from the previous year's crop, and enough rainfall to keep the soil from drying out. And rainfall was one resource Ireland's notoriously wet. Grey climate never failed to provide in abundance. The potato thrived in exactly the kind of poor, wet, rocky soil that made grain farming so unreliable across much of rural Ireland. Where wheat and barley struggled against the damp climate and thin topsoil, the potato simply did not seem to mind nearly as much, tolerating conditions that would have doomed a field of grain to a disappointing, hunger-inducing harvest. For families working the smallest, least fertile plots in the country, the potato was not simply a convenient option among several. It was very often the only crop that made survival mathematically possible at all. Visitors from England and the European continent who travelled through rural Ireland during this period often remarked, with a mixture of surprise and faint condescension, at how thoroughly the country's poorest families had come to depend on a single vegetable, unaware that this dependence was less a matter of choice than of a landholding system that had left those families with almost no viable alternative, and survival on potatoes and little else turned out to be a genuinely viable, sustainable way of life, not merely a desperate stopgap. Combined with buttermilk, a byproduct of butter production that most small farming households could produce themselves by keeping even a single cow, the potato formed a diet that was nutritionally far more complete than its humble reputation might suggest. Potatoes alone provided a solid foundation of carbohydrates for energy, along with meaningful amounts of vitamin C, vitamin B6, and potassium, and even a modest amount of protein, more than most people today would assume a single vegetable could offer. Add the calcium and fat supplied by buttermilk, and a family could, in principle, sustain itself indefinitely on this combination alone, generation after generation, without the dietary catastrophe that 2 centuries of European superstition had once predicted for anyone eating this exact plant. And sustain life it did, on a scale that reshaped the entire demographic character of the island. Ireland's population climbed from roughly 3 million people in the year 1700 to more than 8 million people by 1840. An extraordinary, almost unprecedented rate of growth for the time, achieved without any significant industrial transformation, without major new trade wealth flowing into the country, without any of the usual engines that typically drive that kind of population boom elsewhere in history. The potato, quietly, almost invisibly, was the engine behind it, allowing families on tiny, marginal plots of land to raise more children, and to raise them with a reasonable expectation that those children would survive into adulthood, generation after generation, in numbers that would have been unthinkable on a diet built around unreliable grain harvests alone. Rural Ireland during these decades became one of the most densely populated agricultural landscapes anywhere in Europe. Its countryside dotted with small cottages and potato gardens stretching across land that, under a grain-based system, could never have supported anywhere near the same number of people. Contemporary observers sometimes described the Irish countryside of this period as thriving, even prosperous in its own modest way. Entire communities sustained almost entirely by a plant that polite society elsewhere in Europe had spent 2 centuries refusing to touch. But there was a catastrophic flaw built directly into the foundation of this astonishing growth, one that anyone with a genuine understanding of agriculture could, in theory, have seen coming from a considerable distance. Nearly all of the potatoes grown across the entire island belonged to a single variety, known as the Irish lumper. This was not simply a popular choice among many available options. It was, for the vast majority of Irish tenant farmers, essentially the only option in active cultivation, passed down from one planting season to the next. Seed potato inherited from seed potato, with remarkably little genetic variation introduced anywhere along the way. Think about what that actually means at the level of an entire nation's food supply. Every single potato field in every single county across Ireland was, in a very real biological sense, genetically identical, or close enough to identical that the distinction barely mattered. There was no meaningful diversity built into the system. No backup variety, quietly growing in some corner of the country that might respond differently to disease, drought, or blight. If a disease ever emerged capable of attacking the Irish lumper specifically, that disease would not simply threaten one farmer's harvest or one county's crop. It would threaten every single potato field on the entire island simultaneously, all at once, with no natural firewall anywhere in the system to slow it down or contain it. In other parts of the world where the potato had spread, farmers, sometimes by design and sometimes purely by accident, had kept a wider range of varieties in cultivation, a patchwork of genetic differences that meant a disease striking one type of potato might simply pass over another growing in the very next field. Ireland had, without anyone quite intending it, stripped away that natural safety net entirely. There was no plan for what would happen if that single, uniform, unprotected crop ever failed. There was no reserve of a hardier variety waiting in the wings. There was, in the starkest possible terms, no plan B for an island where a single root vegetable had quietly become the difference between an 8 million person population and a fraction of that number. The entire food supply of an entire nation now rested on one genetic line, of one crop, planted in the same way, in the same soil, harvested at the same time, year after year after year, somewhere out beyond Ireland's shores, carried on ships, drifting on wind, waiting in a form nobody in Ireland had ever seen before. Something was already coming that would find exactly that vulnerability and exploit it completely. The clock had already started. Ireland simply could not hear it ticking yet. In the late summer of 1845, A cargo ship carrying potatoes crossed the Atlantic from the Americas and docked at a European port. Nobody watching that ship being unloaded had any reason to be alarmed. Ships had been carrying potatoes back and forth across the ocean for centuries by that point. An unremarkable, routine part of maritime trade. The exact origin point of the spores themselves has never been pinned down with complete certainty, though most researchers who have studied the outbreak trace its likely path back to potato shipments moving between the Americas and Europe during those years, carried unknowingly alongside cargo that seemed, on the surface, no different from any other load of tubers that had crossed the ocean 1,000 times before without incident. But hidden inside the cargo of that particular ship, invisible to the naked eye, were microscopic spores belonging to an organism called Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that thrives in exactly the kind of cool, damp conditions that define so much of northern European weather, and that defined, almost perfectly, the climate of Ireland itself. The blight moved quickly once it made landfall. It spread first through Belgium and the Netherlands, tearing through potato crops as it went, leaving farmers there staring at fields of blackened, collapsing plants that had looked perfectly healthy only days earlier. From there, it crossed into England. And then, in a development that would prove catastrophic beyond anything Europe had experienced from a crop disease before, it reached Ireland. The effect, once the blight arrived on Irish soil, was almost instantaneous, and it was absolutely devastating. Potato plants that had looked completely healthy in the morning, green, upright, thriving in the damp Irish air, were black, wilted, and actively rotting by the time evening fell on the very same day. Farmers who walked out to check on fields that had shown no sign of trouble just a day or two before would find entire acres of what had been lush. Thriving plants collapsed overnight into a stinking, blackened mush, as though some invisible fire had swept through without leaving a single flame or ember behind. Some farmers described walking their fields at dusk and being unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had checked that very same morning, as though the crop had simply been erased overnight by something no one could see coming and no one could stop once it arrived. There was no warning sign that gave a family enough time to salvage a harvest early. No gradual decline that might have allowed for some kind of partial rescue. The disease simply arrived, and within hours, it had already won. And when desperate farmers dug into the soil, hoping against hope to salvage at least some of the tubers hidden beneath the wilted foliage, they often found that the potatoes themselves had already turned to a foul-smelling, disintegrating pulp underground, destroyed before they were ever even lifted out of the earth. For a family that had planted every available scrap of land with this single crop, staking their entire year's survival on what should have been a reliable, hardy harvest, the discovery that even the tubers safely underground had already turned to rot was a particular kind of despair, one that offered no obvious next step and no clear direction to turn. The smell became one of the most haunting, most frequently remembered details of the entire catastrophe. In the western counties of Ireland, in places like Mayo, Galway, and Clare, the stench of decaying potatoes became so overwhelming, so inescapable, that people took to tying rags and cloths over their noses and mouths simply to breathe as they walked past fields that had been thriving with food only days earlier. It was the smell of an entire nation's food supply rotting in the ground, all at once, with nothing anyone could do to stop it. Some accounts from the time describe travelers refusing to pass through certain stretches of countryside at all during those weeks, choosing longer routes simply to avoid the smell. A small but telling sign of just how completely the disaster had saturated the physical landscape itself. Not merely the fields, but the very air that people were forced to breathe. If the blight had struck only once, Ireland might have weathered the crisis. Bad harvests were not unheard of, and a single devastating year, while painful, was survivable for a population that had endured difficult seasons before. But that is not what happened. The blight came back. It returned in 1846, and this time it struck even harder than it had the year before, wiping out an even larger share of the harvest across the country. It returned again in 1847, and again in 1848, year after year after year. Families who had planted their entire hope for survival into the same soil that had failed them the previous season watched their potatoes rot in the ground yet again, with no reserve left to fall back on, no savings, no alternative crop, and increasingly, no strength left to keep trying. Some families, having lost an entire harvest for the second or third consecutive year, made the desperate gamble of eating their remaining seed potatoes rather than saving them for the next planting. Choosing to survive the present at the direct cost of any hope for the following season. It was not a decision made out of foolishness. It was the arithmetic of genuine starvation, where a distant future harvest means very little to a person who cannot survive the next few weeks without eating something now. As the potato failed again and again, families who had no other meaningful source of food began dying, not in some abstract, distant sense, but in their own homes. On the roadsides, they walked, searching for help. In the ditches beside the very fields where their crops had collapsed into rot. And starvation rarely kills quietly or alone. It weakens the body until almost anything else can finish the job. Diseases like typhus, cholera, and dysentery swept through a population that had already been stripped of the basic nutrition needed to fight off infection, spreading with brutal efficiency through communities where malnourished bodies had almost no resistance left to offer. Entire villages across the west of Ireland were effectively emptied out, their populations dead, fled, or scattered beyond recognition. Workhouses, institutions originally built to house a few hundred of the very poorest members of society, found themselves suddenly overwhelmed with thousands of desperate, starving people crowding through their doors, far beyond anything their capacity had ever been designed to handle. Mass graves opened behind these overcrowded institutions, filled far faster than anyone could have anticipated. An anonymous, unmarked resting place for people whose names, in many cases, were never properly recorded anywhere at all. Local clergy in some of the hardest-hit parishes reportedly struggled simply to keep pace with burials, at times resorting to hinged coffins that could be reused for multiple burials in a single day, lowering a body into the ground, removing the base of the coffin, and repeating the process for the next. A grim, mechanical necessity born entirely out of how quickly the dead were accumulating and how few resources remained to honor each individual loss the way a community would have wished to under any ordinary circumstance. Between 1845 and 1852, roughly 1 million Irish people died as a direct result of starvation and the diseases that followed close behind it. Another million made the desperate decision to leave the island entirely, packing what little they still owned onto ships bound for distant shores, in numbers so large that it amounted to one of the greatest mass migrations in European history up to that point. Many of those ships were so overcrowded, so poorly maintained, and so thoroughly overwhelmed by disease among passengers already weakened by years of hunger, that they became known, grimly and accurately, as coffin ships. Passengers died by the dozens during the long, brutal Atlantic crossing, and their bodies were simply thrown overboard into the ocean. Since there was often no other option available on a vessel with nowhere to properly bury the dead and no time to spare for ceremony, survivors who did complete the crossing often arrived in port cities across North America and Britain in conditions nearly as dire as the ones they had fled. Malnourished, frequently still carrying the diseases that had spread through the crowded holds of the ships that brought them. Greeted in many cases not with sympathy but with quarantine, suspicion, and outright hostility from communities anxious about contagion arriving on their own shores. Ireland's population dropped by roughly 25% in less than a single decade, an almost unimaginable demographic collapse for any nation to endure outside of open warfare. And the country never fully recovered that lost number. Even today, close to 180 years after the blight first appeared in that Irish soil, the population of Ireland remains lower than it was in the years immediately before the famine began. A demographic wound that has simply never fully closed. Walk through parts of rural Ireland today, and you can still find the outlines of abandoned cottages and long since overgrown potato ridges. Faint scars in the landscape left by families who either died where they stood or scattered across the world and never returned. A quiet, physical reminder of just how completely those 7 years reshaped the island. Not for a single generation, but for every generation that has followed since. What makes this catastrophe even harder to sit with? Listening to it now from the comfort of a warm, well-fed present, is how much of the devastation was not simply the unavoidable result of a crop disease, but was actively made worse by deliberate human choices made at the highest levels of government. While Irish families were dying of starvation in their own homes and along their own roadsides, Ireland continued to export substantial quantities of grain, butter, and livestock to England, food that could have fed the very population collapsing around it. And this food often left Irish ports under armed military escort, specifically to prevent starving, desperate crowds from seizing it before it could be shipped away. It is a detail that tends to stop people cold when they first hear it clearly stated. Ships loaded with Irish-grown oats, wheat, and butter sailed out of Irish ports bound for English markets at the very same time that men, women, and children were dying of hunger within sight of those same docks. And the British government, rather than halting those exports to feed the starving population producing the food in the first place, assigned soldiers to guard the shipments and ensure they left the country intact. To the people watching this happen, it was almost impossible not to interpret the message as something close to a formal declaration of whose hunger actually mattered to the government responsible for governing them. Some limited relief did eventually arrive. Soup kitchens were established in various parts of the country, at their peak feeding a significant portion of the population directly, and private charitable efforts, including notably the Religious Society of Friends, more commonly known as the Quakers, organized independent relief work that in many accounts proved considerably more effective, more compassionate, and more free of the moralizing conditions attached to official government aid. But these efforts, however well-intentioned, were operating against a tide of suffering that had already grown far larger than any charitable network could realistically hope to fully address. Arriving late, arriving thin, and arriving into a crisis that had already claimed enormous numbers of lives before meaningful help ever reached the hardest-hit corners of the country. Relief programs that were eventually organized moved slowly, remained chronically underfunded, and were often attached to deliberately degrading conditions designed to discourage people from seeking help at all. Starving men were required to perform grueling hard labor, often building roads that led nowhere in particular. Useless public works projects undertaken purely so officials could justify paying wages that were, in any case, too small to actually purchase the food that was rapidly becoming unaffordable as the crisis deepened. Charles Trevelyan, the senior British Treasury official directly overseeing famine relief efforts, described the unfolding catastrophe in his own official correspondence, not in some private diary or personal letter, but in formal government communication, as something close to a judgment from God upon what he characterized as a morally inferior population. And he argued explicitly that providing too much aid would only encourage unhealthy dependence on charity among the Irish poor. These were not the private musings of an isolated extremist. These were the recorded views of a man with direct control over how much help would reach a starving nation. And those views shaped policy in ways that cost lives. It would be inaccurate, and frankly, a disservice to the people who suffered through it, to describe what happened in Ireland during these years as simply a natural disaster. It began as one, certainly, a genuine and devastating agricultural disease that no one in Ireland had caused and few could have predicted. But what turned that disease into a catastrophe of this scale? A catastrophe that emptied entire counties and reshaped the population of an island for nearly 2 centuries afterward, was a combination of natural failure and deliberate political indifference. Policy choices made by people who had the power to soften the blow and largely chose not to. If the potato had once lifted Ireland to heights of population growth that no grain-based agricultural system could ever have supported, the blight now brought all of that crashing down in one of the most horrific, prolonged humanitarian catastrophes of the entire 19th century. And the consequences of what happened during these 7 brutal years did not simply fade away once the blight itself finally receded. They rippled outward, across oceans, into cities that had never seen a single Irish immigrant before. And they would go on shaping politics, identity, and grievance for generations still to come. The 1 million people who fled Ireland during those 7 catastrophic years did not simply vanish into the wider world once they stepped off the ships that carried them away. They arrived somewhere, and in arriving, they began quietly reshaping the cities and countries that received them. Whether those places were ready for that change or not, massive waves of Irish immigrants poured into the growing cities of the eastern United States, into Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, cities that had never absorbed a wave of newcomers quite like this one before, arriving in such staggering numbers, in such visibly desperate condition, and practicing a religion that much of Protestant America still viewed with open suspicion. The reception these immigrants received was often harsh. Signs advertising jobs in some American cities during this period bluntly stated that Irish applicants need not bother applying at all. Employment notices reading "No Irish Need Apply" became common enough in some cities that the phrase itself survived long afterward as shorthand for the particular brand of prejudice these immigrants faced. A small phrase carrying an enormous weight of everyday rejection. Cartoons in popular newspapers caricatured Irish immigrants in crude, dehumanizing ways, portraying them as unintelligent, drunken, and prone to violence. A hostility rooted in a toxic combination of religious prejudice, ethnic bigotry, and simple fear of a labor market suddenly flooded with desperate workers willing to accept almost any wage. And yet, in spite of that hostility, or in many respects because of it, Irish immigrants did not simply endure. They organized, crowded into dense, often squalid urban neighborhoods. Irish communities built their own churches, their own mutual aid societies, and eventually their own political networks, learning quickly that survival in a hostile new country depended heavily on collective strength rather than individual struggle. Irish immigrants and their American-born children went on to play a foundational role in the early American labor movement, organizing workers in industries that offered grueling conditions and meager pay. And they became deeply embedded in the political machinery of major American cities, building organizations that would shape urban American politics for generations to come. The same pattern repeated itself across the wider English-speaking world. Irish immigrants settled in Liverpool and Glasgow, in Melbourne, and in Toronto, each of these cities absorbing its own significant Irish population and its own version of the same uneasy transition from outsider suspicion to eventual, if often grudging, integration. But these immigrants did not leave everything behind on the docks of Cork or Dublin when they boarded those ships. They carried with them a deep, generational anger directed at the British government whose policies, whose exports under armed guard, whose officials, who had described mass starvation as a form of divine judgment, had turned an agricultural disease into a demographic catastrophe. That anger did not fade quietly with distance or with time. It hardened into something more organized, more political, feeding directly into the Irish nationalist movements that gained strength across the following decades. Movements built substantially on the memory of what had happened during those famine years, and on the conviction that Ireland's future safety depended on no longer being governed by a power that had allowed, and in some respects actively worsened, that level of suffering. That long arc of grievance and organizing eventually contributed to Irish independence in 1922, a political outcome that, in a very real sense, traces at least part of its roots back to a blighted potato field nearly 8 decades earlier. The Great Famine did not simply empty out the Irish countryside. It scattered Irish communities, Irish culture, and Irish political grievance across the entire English-speaking world. And the reverberations of that scattering remain visible today, in the Irish-American communities of Boston and New York, in the cultural fabric of cities from Liverpool to Melbourne, in the very existence of an independent Irish state whose modern identity was forged, in part, in the memory of those 7 brutal years. But there is a strange and unexpected part of this story that tends to surprise people once they hear it clearly laid out. The famine did not destroy the potato's reputation. If anything, the disaster proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, just how genuinely indispensable this crop had become to feeding large populations efficiently. The lesson the wider world eventually took from what happened in Ireland was not that potatoes themselves were too dangerous or unreliable to grow. The lesson was something far more specific, and in hindsight, far more obvious. Never stake an entire food supply on a single genetic variety of anything. Grow more types. Breed deliberately for resistance. Diversify, so that no single disease can ever again find an entire nation's food supply standing defenseless and identical. Field after field. County after county. That lesson did not emerge instantly or all at once. It took careful scientific work to even properly understand what had caused the blight in the first place. It was not until 1861, more than a decade after the worst of the Irish famine had passed, that a German botanist named Heinrich Anton de Bary published detailed findings describing the complete life cycle of Phytophthora infestans, the water mold responsible for the entire catastrophe. De Bary's careful, methodical work effectively helped establish an entirely new scientific discipline, plant pathology, the systematic study of what causes disease in crops and how those diseases actually spread, a field of science that, remarkably, barely existed in any organized form before this single crop's failure forced the question with such devastating urgency. In the decades that followed de Bary's breakthrough, plant breeders across Europe and the Americas began deliberately developing new potato varieties, specifically selected for resistance to Phytophthora infestans, moving away from the kind of dangerous genetic uniformity that had made Ireland's entire food supply so catastrophically vulnerable in the first place. Agricultural scientists established seed potato programs designed explicitly to preserve and distribute genetic diversity, ensuring that no single region would ever again find its entire harvest resting on one fragile, identical genetic line. The disaster that had nearly erased an island's population became, almost paradoxically, the catalyst for an entirely new era of scientific, deliberately diversified potato farming, a transformation that would go on to shape how this crop was grown across the rest of the entire world. And that transformation was only just beginning. Because while Europe was still absorbing the hard lessons of the Irish famine, the potato itself was already quietly taking root in places far beyond anywhere it had ever grown before. In the vast wheat fields of Russia, in the mountain provinces of China, across the plains of India, and eventually across an entire continent that had never seen this humble Andean tuber at all. Russia had already been fighting its own long, difficult battle over the potato well before the Irish famine ever forced the rest of the world to reckon with the crop's fragility. And by the time that battle finally ended, the outcome was almost impossible to imagine looking back at how it began. We already saw how the 1840s brought open rebellion, entire villages rising up and burning the very potato fields officials were attempting to force upon them, resisting a crop that generations of orthodox teaching had condemned as a sin against God himself. And yet, by the close of the 19th century and into the early years of the 20th, Russia had transformed into one of the largest potato-producing nations anywhere on the planet. Fields that villagers had once set ablaze in open defiance now stretched across the countryside as one of the nation's most reliable and important staple crops, feeding a rural population that had, within the span of 2 or 3 generations, gone from burning this vegetable in protest to depending on it for daily survival. Still affectionately known in many households as the second bread, it is a genuinely remarkable reversal to sit with. A food once condemned as spiritually dangerous enough to threaten a peasant's soul, now sitting in the same cellar as the sacks of flour used to bake the bread eaten at church festivals, the two staples coexisting as though the century of resistance between them had never happened at all. Halfway around the world, in China, the potato story unfolded on an entirely different, far slower timeline. European missionaries and merchants had first introduced the crop sometime during the 1600s, but for a very long stretch afterward, it remained little more than a minor curiosity, grown in scattered gardens without ever becoming a serious part of Chinese agriculture. That changed only when farmers in the mountainous interior provinces, in places like Yunnan, Sichuan, and Guizhou, began to recognize something remarkable about this foreign tuber. It could thrive at altitudes and in soil conditions where rice paddies simply could not function and where wheat struggled to produce a reliable yield. In a country where good farmland at lower, gentler elevations was already stretched thin, trying to feed an enormous population, the potato offered something genuinely new, a way to pull real, substantial nutrition out of mountainous terrain that had previously been considered marginal at best for serious food production. Once that realization took hold, adoption accelerated dramatically. By the middle of the 20th century, China had become the single largest potato-producing country on the entire planet, and today the country grows more than 90 million metric tons of potatoes every single year, more than any other nation on Earth. a staggering transformation for a crop that spent its first several centuries in China as little more than a botanical footnote. India followed a somewhat parallel path, though on its own distinct timeline. British colonial officials introduced the potato to the Indian subcontinent late in the 1700s. And much like in China, it took several decades before the crop moved meaningfully beyond small experimental plots into serious, widespread cultivation. Once Indian farmers began adopting it in earnest, however, production expanded rapidly. And today, India stands as the second largest potato-producing nation on the planet, trailing only China. The crop has become so deeply woven into Indian cuisine, appearing in dishes served in nearly every region and every kind of household across the country, that many people today simply assume it must be native to the subcontinent, with little sense that this now essential ingredient actually traveled there from halfway across the world by way of European colonial trade routes. Regional Indian dishes built around the potato vary enormously from one part of the country to another, a testament to just how thoroughly local cooks absorbed this foreign ingredient into existing culinary traditions, rather than treating it as some separate, imported novelty sitting awkwardly alongside older native staples. Across the African continent, the potato arrived considerably later than in Europe or Asia. But once it did arrive, it spread with genuinely surprising speed. Countries situated in the East African highlands, places like Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Uganda, began adopting potato cultivation over the course of the 20th century. And farmers there quickly discovered that the crop performed exceptionally well in the cool, elevated climates found throughout these highland regions. Conditions that echoed, in a distant way, the very Andean mountain environment where wild potatoes had first grown 8,000 years earlier. The United Nations and its Food and Agriculture Organization have since identified the potato as one of the single most important tools available for fighting hunger and malnutrition across the developing world. And multiple African nations have gone on to launch dedicated national potato programs, specifically aimed at increasing production and strengthening long-term food security for their populations. Taken together, these separate stories, Russian villages that once rioted against the crop, Chinese mountain farmers who found a use for it that lowland rice could never provide, Indian households who now consider it a native ingredient, and African highland communities using it as a genuine shield against hunger, paint a picture of just how completely this once despised root vegetable has embedded itself into the daily life of nearly every corner of the inhabited world. Globally, the potato now ranks as the fourth most important food crop on the entire planet, trailing only wheat, rice, and corn in overall importance to human nutrition. More than 300 million metric tons of potatoes are produced every single year, across more than 150 different countries, spanning nearly every climate and continent capable of supporting agriculture at all. It is worth pausing here to really sit with the scale of what that represents. A plant that Spanish conquistadors once walked past without a second thought, that French officials once formally blamed for spreading leprosy, that Russian clergy once condemned from the pulpit as the devil's own fruit, and that Scottish ministers once refused to touch because it appeared nowhere in Scripture, is now quietly feeding a meaningful share of the entire human species. In climates and cultures, the original Andean farmers, who first coaxed the poison out of a wild, walnut-sized tuber, could never have possibly imagined reaching. But even this remarkable global spread, as impressive as it is, was still only the story of the potato as food. Because in the centuries that followed, this same humble crop was about to reveal itself as something far stranger and far more versatile than anyone, in any country, had ever expected. By the time the potato had conquered farmland across nearly every populated continent on Earth, it was already quietly branching out into something far beyond simple sustenance, working its way into culture, industry, and eventually into some of the most recognizable foods in the entire modern world. French fries likely originated somewhere in Belgium or France sometime toward the end of the 1700s. Though exactly which country deserves credit remains a genuinely contested point of national pride to this day, with each side able to point to its own local tradition of frying sliced potatoes in hot fat long before the dish carried any particular name at all. Whatever its precise origin, the simple technique of cutting potatoes into strips and frying them until crisp eventually grew into what may well be the single most popular cooked food on the entire planet. Today, French fries and similar fried potato products form a multi-billion-dollar global industry, and in the United States alone, the average person consumes something in the neighborhood of 50 pounds of frozen potato products every single year. The overwhelming majority of that total arriving on a plate in the familiar shape of a fry. Fast food restaurants across the country now compete openly on the specific texture and preparation of their fries. A level of attention to a single fried vegetable that would have seemed absurd to the European farmers who spent 2 centuries refusing to plant it at all. The potato chip has its own colorful origin story, one that has been told and retold so many times it has taken on the polished, slightly too perfect shape of genuine folklore. According to the popular version of events, sometime around 1853, a chef working at a resort in Saratoga Springs, New York, found himself dealing with an unusually difficult customer who kept sending his fried potatoes back to the kitchen, complaining they were cut too thick. In frustration, the story goes, the chef sliced a batch of potatoes as thin as he possibly could, fried them until they were crisp beyond anything resembling a normal potato dish, and seasoned them heavily, intending the whole plate as something closer to a pointed joke than an actual meal. The customer, according to this well-worn legend, loved them instantly. It is a wonderful story. And it is worth being honest that historians who have dug into the actual documentary record are considerably less certain that events unfolded quite this neatly. Since thinly sliced fried potatoes appear in cookbooks from around the same general period without any of this specific drama attached, recipes describing very thinly sliced, deep-fried potato preparations can be found scattered across English and French cookbooks from decades before 1853, suggesting the basic technique likely evolved gradually across multiple kitchens rather than springing fully formed from a single act of culinary spite in one resort town. Whatever the true origin, the potato chip went on to become its own enormous global industry, with the average American consuming somewhere around 30 pounds of fresh potatoes and another 17 pounds of potato chips every single year. Few institutions illustrate the sheer industrial scale of modern potato consumption quite as clearly as McDonald's. The company uses more than 3 billion pounds of potatoes annually just to keep its restaurants supplied with fries, sourcing the overwhelming majority of that enormous volume from farms concentrated in Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, states whose economies have become deeply intertwined with the specific varieties of potato best suited to producing a long, evenly golden fry. Entire regional agricultural economies in the American Pacific Northwest have grown up around supplying this single fast food chain, with local farmers cultivating specific russet varieties bred over decades specifically for their length, starch content, and consistent frying behavior. a level of agricultural specialization that would have been entirely unimaginable to the Prussian peasants once threatened with mutilation simply for planting any potato at all. But potatoes are far more than simply food. And this is often the part of the story that catches people most off guard. Potato starch, extracted through processes not entirely unlike the ones Andean farmers were refining thousands of years earlier, has become a genuinely important industrial material, used in manufacturing paper, textile, adhesivos, and increasingly, biodegradable plastics designed to break down naturally rather than persist in landfills for centuries. Vodka, one of the most widely consumed spirits anywhere on Earth, has traditionally been produced from potatoes across Poland, Scandinavia, and Russia for centuries, continuing a tradition that traces directly back to those early Polish distillers who first discovered that starchy tubers made a cheaper raw material than grain. And then there is a chapter of the potato's industrial history that feels almost too strange to be true, yet is thoroughly documented. During the Second World War, German industrial chemists worked out how to convert potato starch into synthetic rubber suitable for military vehicle tires. A critical wartime innovation made necessary when Japanese forces cut off Germany's access to natural rubber supplies flowing out of Southeast Asia. It was a striking, almost ironic use of the crop. The very same starchy tuber that had once fed hungry peasants and starving prisoners of war, now being chemically transformed into the treads that carried military vehicles across the battlefields of the same continent that had spent 2 centuries fearing it. At the very same time, in a far darker use of this same crop, the Nazi regime dramatically restricted which potato varieties German farmers were legally permitted to grow, part of a broader effort to control and standardize agriculture under state direction. Where German farmers in the 1910s had cultivated something like 1,500 distinct potato varieties, by 1941, that number had been officially reduced to a mere 74 approved varieties. A stark illustration of how thoroughly totalitarian control could reach even into something as seemingly apolitical as which type of tuber a farmer was allowed to plant in his own field. Beyond fuel for tires and fuel for soldiers, potato derivatives show up today in an almost bewildering range of everyday products, appearing in pharmaceuticals, in cosmetics, in animal feed formulated for livestock across the world, and in one small, almost charming detail, in the simple adhesive coating the back of a postage stamp, the potato, it turns out, is not merely feeding the world in countless quiet, largely invisible ways. It is holding parts of the modern industrial world physically together. And as remarkable as all of this already sounds, the potato story was still not finished, expanding into stranger and more unexpected territory. Because in the closing years of the 20th century, this same crop that had once grown wild and mildly poisonous on a windswept Andean mountainside was about to leave the mountainside behind entirely, and leave the planet itself. In 1995, the potato achieved something that no vegetable in the entire history of human agriculture had ever managed before. It became the first vegetable ever successfully grown in outer space. NASA, working in partnership with researchers at the University of Wisconsin, carried potato plants aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia as part of an experiment exploring how crops might one day be grown during long-duration space missions. Missions that could eventually stretch on for months or even years without any possibility of resupply from Earth. Watching potato plants take root and grow in that carefully controlled environment, suspended far above the very planet where this crop first clawed its way out of toxic obscurity 8,000 years earlier. agricultural scientists began seriously entertaining a question that would have sounded like pure science fiction to every single person in this entire story we have just walked through. From the Aymara farmers detoxifying wild tubers in mountain streams, to the Irish families who once staked their entire survival on a single genetic line of this same plant. If humanity ever establishes permanent colonies on the Moon or on Mars, agricultural scientists studying the question today believe the potato will almost certainly rank among the very first crops planted there. And the reasoning behind that belief traces directly back to the exact same qualities that allowed this plant to survive in one of the harshest farming environments already found here on Earth. It grows successfully in poor, mineral-heavy soil that would leave most other crops struggling to take root at all. It produces significantly more calories per acre than nearly any grain crop humans currently rely on, an efficiency that matters enormously when every square foot of growing space on another world would need to be accounted for with extreme precision. It requires considerably less water than crops like rice. A critical advantage on a planet or a lunar colony where water itself may be one of the scarcest and most carefully rationed resources available. And it stores remarkably well under harsh, unforgiving conditions. A lesson the Inca had already mastered through Chunio, thousands of years before anyone had ever imagined a spacecraft at all. Researchers at agricultural institutions studying potato genetics today, including seed banks that maintain thousands of distinct varieties gathered from across the Andes, continue working to identify which of these ancient, largely forgotten strains might handle the specific stresses of extraterrestrial soil best. Radiation exposure, extreme temperature swings, and the strange, low-gravity environments no farmer in any of the centuries we have covered tonight ever had reason to imagine. There is something worth sitting with quietly here. In these final moments of the story, the same qualities that once allowed a small group of Andean farmers to coax a mildly poisonous mountain weed into becoming a reliable source of food on some of the harshest, least forgiving farmland anywhere on the planet, are now the very same qualities agricultural scientists point to when they discuss what humanity might plant on a completely different world entirely. Nothing about the potato itself has fundamentally changed since those first tentative harvests beside Lake Titicaca. What has changed is simply how far humanity has been willing to carry it, and how far we may yet carry it still. Think, for a moment, about the full arc of everything we have just walked through together. A small, toxic, walnut-sized tuber that Andean farmers spent thousands of patient years transforming into something edible, without ever using the word genetics. An empire that turned this humble root into the very foundation of its logistics, its military campaigns, and its spiritual life. Spanish conquistadors who walked directly past it in pursuit of gold and silver, never once recognizing that the very food keeping their own colonial minds running was the crop they considered beneath their notice. A Europe that feared it for 2 entire centuries, blamed it for leprosy, called it the devil's own fruit, and refused it a place in Scripture. A Prussian king and a French pharmacist who, through stubbornness, theater, and simple hunger, dragged an entire continent toward finally accepting it. A small island that grew so completely dependent on this single crop that its failure, when it finally came, killed and displaced millions of people and permanently reshaped the population of an entire nation. And from the ashes of that catastrophe, a crop that not only survived, but went on to become one of the single most important food sources on the entire planet, feeding hundreds of millions of people across every inhabited continent on Earth. Not bad, in the end, for a lumpy, unglamorous root vegetable that almost nobody, anywhere, ever actually wanted. If you found yourself drifting off somewhere along the way tonight, that is exactly what this was made for. And if you are still here, thank you for staying with the whole strange, sprawling journey of this humble little tuber, from a poisonous mountain weed to a possible future crop on Mars. If you enjoyed this, feel free to hit subscribe. And let us know in the comments what time it is where you are, and which part of the potato's long, strange history surprised you the most. Sleep well,